appreciate it. I'm very excited to present this overview of zero trust and how Threatlocker approaches zero trust. And I've been with Threatlocker here, which is a zero trust endpoint protection platform. So we want to make sure that zero trust is something that's easy to achieve, to implement, to manage. And today's focus really is just to give you guys an overview what zero trust is, how it can be applied in most environments that we see out there, how it can be something that's easy to achieve, and all the benefits that you get from it, really. So that's the plan here for today's demonstration. Did anybody else need to introduce themselves before I jump in?
Good to
All right,
go?
great. So I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen here. Beautiful. So yeah, today, like I was saying, we're going to talk about zero trust and demystify that. And I just want to start from the beginning. Now, what is zero trust? We keep hearing that word nowadays. It's become more like a buzzword. So the way we see zero trust really is least privilege, that principle of least privilege. Deny by default and allow by exception. We don't want to trust that just because an application is trying to run in your environment, that it's trustworthy, we're going to allow it by default, just because we don't know it to be bad yet. We don't want a device to remote into your endpoint just because it can. It might not be a trusted source. We don't want is any program to access your storage devices just because it can, just because Windows allows it by default. So this principle of least privilege is really powerful in today's world because we're seeing more and more than just relying and detecting bad behavior or bad software is not enough because of all the zero-day exploits that we see, all the vulnerabilities that happen with trusted applications. One of the things that we need to think about um, software, whether that's trusted or untrusted software, is that every time that you open it in your computer, that software can access everything that you can. So if you are a regular user with limited access to some places in your environment, well, you can still access those environments or those locations with a lot of programs that may have no business reaching out to those locations. So this is a very important concept, and a lot of people fail to see this as something that's really dangerous. Is that software by default can access everything that you can. So if you're trying to run an app in your environment, that app is going to have access to your other applications. It's going to be able to communicate with PowerShell, with command prompt. If you're opening Adobe, for example, within Adobe, if there is a vulnerability, for instance, it can try to go and access data that has no business accessing. It can try to go to the network and go to a malicious website when you didn't even need to have access in the first place. So a lot of the big cyber attacks that we've seen recently actually involved trusted applications doing things that they shouldn't be doing in their environments. For example, I'm sure a lot of you recall the Felina vulnerability in Microsoft Office that happened, I believe it was in 2022. So if you ask anybody on the street, everybody trusts Microsoft Office, right? It's one of those applications that, it's there by default and there's so many good uses for it. But it had a vulnerability that even with macros disabled, it impacted a lot of businesses. It caused a lot of damage simply because it was using a trusted application with macros disabled. Simply opening it would kick off the MSDT service, which would then call to PowerShell, which would then download a malicious payload online and run that executable in the environment.
Wow.
So you can see here, I'm going to show you is a short video of the Felina vulnerability in action. Somebody goes and opens a Word document. Maybe they got this through a phishing email, and Word is trying to open it here. The diagnostics tool is going to start running. We've all seen this before. Sometimes when we're trying to open, a big file, a big Word document, and it keeps trying. And in the background, what it's actually doing is it's calling to PowerShell to run an executable and cause damage in your environment. So notice here PowerShell ran, and here's the executable that was able to run. In this case, it was just ha ha ha, you lose, but this could be anything, right? And this is something that people by default allow in their environments. And I believe they should continue to allow Office to run, of course. There's so many opportunities, so many applications out there that have great business opportunities, a lot of business cases. But the issue is those applications shouldn't just do anything that it's called to do. You shouldn't be able to do anything in your environment. There should be some parameters in place, some limitations to limit the scope so that things like this Felina vulnerability doesn't happen in the future. And nowadays, here's where the gap is, because how is malware detected? So at first we had traditional antivirus, right? You would have a database of hashes and things like that, and it would cross-reference that with what's running in your environment. If it detects that there's something malicious, it's going to try to block it or quarantine it. Then we started working with more advanced AVs, the next-gen AVs, which did a little better job at detecting malicious behavior in your environment. And now we are more on that EDR realm, where in my mind, EDR is just like another next gen AV. It does a better job at reacting to things, so no longer is relying on just detecting it, but it can also do some reaction as well. So we like EDR tools. We think it has its place in an environment, but we believe that it should be an add-on to a zero trust foundation in security. Because when we think about those tests that happen when third parties test malware and EDR tools, a lot of times we see that 100% of malware is detected during AV and EDR tests. So all those malware that they tested against a lot of the famous EDRs out there, the EDRs were able to detect that. But the problem is that also 100% of successful cyber attacks, they were not detected in time or at all. So clearly there is a gap there. Clearly EDRs, AVs is not enough to combat these modern attacks that we see happening every day. There is something there that's not clicking. And that's what we believe is zero trust. I think the future of endpoint security is zero trust simply because of the fact that with zero trust, you don't need to necessarily know that something is bad to block it from running in your environment. You can, with zero trust, allow what you need and block everything else, including executables, DLLs, PowerShell scripts. And it is possible to make it easy so that users can request access to things that they don't have access to. So if somebody's trying to run an executable in your environment that you haven't seen before, that you haven't trusted, they are able to request that access with Threatlocker so that you can vet it out first and approve it if appropriate. So this eliminates a lot of the risks involved with current threats, because those threats, a lot of times they go through and EDRs, AVs don't detect it simply because they don't know it to be bad. They allow things to go and run by default. They only try to block something that they know to be bad. The danger, of course, is the unknown.
So, Matthias, quick question on that.
Yes.
If I as a user request access and okay, never mind, let me change hats. And I'm on the IT team, do I get the file? Can I put it in a sandbox? What does that look like from an evaluation standpoint?
Yeah, so with Threatlocker, there's several options that you can use. So when you receive the request for a lot of executables, it's easy to run that in a virtual environment. So we make it very easy for you to spin up a virtual machine that's hosted by us in the cloud, and you can install and run that executable on that virtual environment. And we also offer a risk center in that VM that is going to show you what that application is trying to do in the environment. If it's what are the files that are being installed, we can cross-reference those with VirusTotal as well to check if it's something that's already known to be potentially harmful in their environment. It can also see what is doing in the system. Is it perhaps adding itself to the startup menu and things like that? So that's a great question, because
Yeah.
when you're dealing with zero trust, you need to have a platform that allows you to easily implement it, but also easily manage it, right? You don't want it to be a burden for the end user to request access and then not be able to have it approved in time,
Right.
or having difficulties troubleshooting. So with a zero trust approach, which is the future of endpoint security, you need a platform that can help you manage that easily and smoothly. And so when we talk about zero trust, of course, we are focusing today mostly on the endpoint side of the house. Um, so when I think of zero trust at the endpoint, the first thing that comes to mind is blocking unauthorized software, right? That's the easiest thing, the most straightforward thing that you can do is just only allow what's needed and block everything else. I promise you, the list of things that you need in your environment is much shorter than the list of things that you don't want in your environment. And if you go to, sometimes I go to the AV Atlas website just to see like the statistics in AV in current threats, and I see that like week after week, thousands and thousands of new malware are detected. So since I started talking right now in today's webinar, hundreds of new malware were created. And I don't want to bet the security of my environment on a tool that needs to be constantly updating their databases to try to recognize these malware on time to make sure that they can stop that from running in my environment. A much more proactive approach is to block all untrusted software from running in the first place. So blocking unauthorized software is something that is essential for zero trust. It's something that we believe it's the core for zero trust. The other thing too that we need to think about, and I touched on this a little bit, is the applications that you already trust, that you already allow your users to run in your environment. You don't want them to be weaponized against you like the Microsoft Office was weaponized against so many companies in 2022, right? And that's where the concept of ring fencing comes in. Ring fencing is really it's a trademark product of ours that essentially allows you to place guardrails around the applications in your environment, where you can control what other apps they can reach out to, what data they can reach out to. Can they go out to the internet? Can they touch your files? Can they tweak the registry? Because if you recall here in the beginning here when I was showing you, by default, applications have that access granted to them. They can communicate with other applications just fine. And that's why in the Felina vulnerability, Word was able to communicate with PowerShell. There was nothing there preventing that from happening. And so with ring fencing, the intent here is to really limit that. Your Chrome browser, for example, yes, it needs access to the internet, but does it need access to perhaps all your files? Does it need access to PowerShell, the command prompt? So with ring fencing, you can limit what the applications can do in your environment. So they can do what they're supposed to do, but then you can also prevent them from reaching out to things that they shouldn't. I have other examples too, other than just the Felina vulnerability. I'm pretty sure a lot of you have heard of the SolarWinds Orion attack, and then also the 3CX vulnerability. Those were tools that people trust, that the companies, enterprises, Fortune 500 companies trust in their environment. But when they became vulnerable, what happened? They were impacted by it, even though they had the latest and greatest EDR and AV tools. And the reason being is because it was a new vulnerability and it was using a trusted application. And that application could, by default, go anywhere on the internet, really. And with ring fencing, we are able to stop this type of connection to take place. So for a lot of our customers, we were able to prevent the SolarWinds, the 3CX application from reaching out to malicious places online by default, and without even realizing that we were doing it in the first place, because we don't need to know that it's bad to stop it. By the time everybody else realized it was a vulnerability, that it was a malicious action, we're already blocking that. So this concept of ring fencing, I said, is a trademark part of ours, but really the concept is rooted in zero trust, whereas don't allow an application to do anything just because it can, just because it has a default access. We need to think about securely configuring these applications securely and limiting their scope. This can mitigate so many different vulnerabilities out there because um, application hopping, living out the land attacks, these are terms that I'm pretty sure most of us have heard before. Those are the super common ways that attacks happen in your environment. If somebody has access to your Adobe application, your Office application, they don't want to stay there like the Felina. They want to go to PowerShell. They want to go to command prompt. They want to go to another application to steal your data. So by ring fencing, you can really stop these types of interactions from happening in the first place. You can close the window and lock it. And also, the other thing that we need to think about here with zero trust at the endpoint level is admin rights. We local administrators is an issue. Um, so if you guys are like me and you guys want to take that approach of the principle of least privilege, you probably don't want to have too many local admin accounts in your environment, right? You want to limit that. You want to limit that to perhaps just your IT team. I'm pretty sure a lot of you have seen this before, but whenever I investigate some current attacks that have been successful, that have been impacting a lot of companies, a lot of times those attacks leverage a compromised admin account, an admin account that was easy to hack into. So obviously with that admin account, they have more privileges, more access to do things with PowerShell, command prompt. So it's really important to strip away those rights. But we also want to think about efficacy, right? The ability for your users to do what they're supposed to do. And sometimes people do need elevated access to run certain applications or certain tasks or to run some updates. And I believe there is a balance that can be struck between giving the appropriate elevation without giving too much. And that's what elevation control is all about, is you take away admin rights, but then you can also give the ability for the user to request access when they need that elevation. So if they need to run an application like Notepad++, for example, as an admin user, well, they should be able to request that and you should be able to give it to them, but just for that application. Don't need to give them a local admin account where they can go and to another application and run that as an admin as well. We want to make sure that you can give your users just in time and just enough access. So in this case here, if I knew what the user needed Notepad++ for, maybe it was just for a special project for the day, I could give them temporary elevation. If I know they're going to be using this application all the time and they need admin access all the time, then I can make it into a permanent elevation, but only within the scope of Notepad++, nothing else. So another simple thing that can be done to adhere to zero trust and to limit the exposure of admins by threat actors. So threat actors can't leverage those admin accounts to be used and weaponized against your environment. And of course, there are other things too that you can do at the endpoint level to adhere to zero trust. The secure configuration, there are a lot of ways of deploying tools, a lot of configurations that you can disable by default. So it's very important to have some structure in place in your organization on how you're going to be deploying that, how are you going to be installing software, are all the packages needed for that software, what can be disabled. Make sure that you're aware of the security risks of the applications that you're installing. Patching is super important as well. Patching is something that you can do with a lot of different tools out there, and it can eliminate a lot of those vulnerabilities. And one interesting thing about patching is that a lot of times patches occur once the applications, those programs realize that there's a vulnerability. And sometimes they realize that because customers were hit by it. By the time they patch things, it's too late. So of course, it's still important to patch things, but if you're managing endpoints, you don't want to rely on only when that patching is available. You want to make sure that you're limiting the scope of those applications in case there is a vulnerability. And until the patch comes through, you want to be protected. So Threatlocker ourselves, we're not a patching tool, but we, of course, are advocates of patching because of all the risks that it can mitigate. Control storage, that's another thing that we need to think about as well. And I touched that a little bit in the beginning. With group policy, what can you do? With group policy, you can limit which users can access certain places in your environment. But those users by default have hundreds of applications in their environment, and those applications could also be used to access data that has nothing to do with those applications. So, for example, if you have an accounting department, you probably want to allow them to have access to the accounting folder with financial invoices, with financial statements. But should they really be allowed to use PowerShell to access that data? Should they really be allowed to use command prompt to access that data? Or should they only be using their financial program to access that data? So it's really important to not only limit which users can access sensitive data in your environment, but also controlling what programs they can use to access that. Because when you do that, by default, you're also limiting what programs a threat actor could use in your endpoint to access that information. You know, so an example I like to show is like a backup share, and you have a backup program. Perhaps you should only allow your backup program to access that share, nothing else, because there's no point. And just by doing a simple policy to say, hey, I'll allow my backup program to access my backup share, you can greatly diminish the risk that, your other applications would be used against you to access that backup share. And of course, we also believe in endpoint detection and response, EDR tools. And there's a reason why it's here at the bottom of the list, is because it's still important, but it should be an add-on to the foundation of zero trust. Blocking by default, only allowing what's needed, making sure that what's allowed to run is ring-fenced, or it's limited to what it can do in your environment. And then we have an EDR on top that can alert you of known indicators of compromise based on, the MITRE ATT&CK framework, CISA, what have you. And the cool thing about having an EDR on top of zero trust is that, like for example, the EDR that Threatlocker offers, which is called Threatlocker Detect, it can alert you of things that we're already blocking too. So if we see that an IP scanner is trying to run, our application control is going to block that, but our EDR is going to see that as a knock on the door, somebody trying to barge in. So it sends you an alert. So EDR has its place, but we just don't think it should be the foundation of your security stack, just based on historical evidence on how all these attacks are successful despite detection being there. So we see that it's not enough. It's still important, but we need to make sure it's in the appropriate place in your security stack. And we also need to think about the network when it comes to your endpoint as well. So it's one thing for us to control inbound, outbound access on the perimeter side. It's another thing to do it at the endpoint side. And in today's world, it's not enough to just control network on your perimeter firewall. A lot of people work from home. There's other types of traffic that you're not going to have visibility. Your perimeter firewall is not going to be able to deter. And network control at the endpoint is crucial when you can block outbound and inbound access that's not trusted, especially when it comes to inbound access, right? We don't want to allow access to your servers, for example, from untrusted sources. So one of the big things that we see happening is remote encryption attacks, which happens by, an unmanaged device being vulnerable because a hacker can connect to it and it can encrypt their data remotely. And that's something that we don't want to continue to allow happening. So I'm going to share here my screen. Let's see if you guys can see that. And I'm going to share with you network control policies. So a host-based firewall solution here. The idea is, especially when you're talking about inbound traffic, is when it comes to zero trust, is continue to allow what's needed to run. So you can make policies to permit that, and then block everything else by default. You don't want IoT devices reaching out to your servers. You don't want remote encryption attacks happening. So when you can be granular about what you are permitting at the endpoint level, you can really reduce a lot of threats. Because a lot of ransomware attacks do start in the network side of things. And of course, it goes on to impact the endpoint. So one of the great things that you can do with a host-based firewall solution like network control is the ability to also be granular when it comes to network traffic. For example, maybe in your environment, you do need to allow your IT team to access your servers remotely. So you can open port 3389 to allow that to happen. But there's no reason to allow anybody else to access the servers remotely, right? Even if it's a machine in your environment. So you can do it the traditional way and use the IP addresses to say, okay, only these IPs can access this servers. But in today's world, this is not sufficient because IPs change all the time with the HCP. So a better way is to use dynamic access control lists, right? Where even if IPs change, you can still allow the traffic to go through if it's coming from a trusted source, if there can be a handshake that can authenticate that connection. One of the ways you can do that is through objects. In this case, your objects are computers or computer groups that have the Threatlocker agent installed. So you can limit traffic not only based on the IP, but based on whether or not the machine has a Threatlocker agent installed, and if it belongs to a specific computer group. So here I'm saying only the IT team can access my servers remotely. If another machine in my environment tries to access my servers remotely, it won't be able to. So this is really powerful because you are adding an additional handshake to the connection and you're further segmentizing your environment. You're not just allowing that port open for your internal network, you are allowing it for a specific group of users. And I have something here to show you, another thing here to show you as well, which is a very quick snippet of those policies being implemented real world. So here you're going to see that I'm going to attempt a remote RDP connection. And notice that it allows me to do so no problem because I am part of the IT team. So it allows me to connect to the server. Perfect. Now, what would happen if, let's say you had a threat actor in your environment who, let's say he even stole your RDP credentials and he's trying to remote in to your servers. You're going to go ahead, try to connect. You keep spinning. Nothing's happening. And the reason why it's because that handshake is not taking place. That machine doesn't have the Threatlocker agent installed. It's a rogue machine. It's not part of the IT team, so it's unable to connect to the server. So with a very simple policy like that at the endpoint level, controlling your network traffic, you can limit this type of attack from succeeding. And it's not difficult to implement either. It's something that is just a matter of opening the ports for the people that need it and blocking by default for everybody else. And of course, IOC detection and response, it's also important. So again, that EDR side of the house, again, there's a reason why it's at the bottom of the list is because it's still important, but it should be there as more like a plan B instead of being the basis of your security stance, even when it comes to the network traffic. Any questions, guys, so far from anybody? I know I'm talking a lot here, so take a little break for water.
No, yeah, it's a lot of good stuff going on here, and this is, is this all? I'm sure you'll get into it, but I can manage this all in one portal. Is this a, you know, what's it look like to, I guess, really implement this? And I'm sure you'll get into this later, but learning the environment and then getting the getting my IT team, up to speed and on board. Uh, I
Yeah,
assuming,
absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah, I can definitely do, have to go over that. And it's one of the things like that I mentioned in the beginning is with Threatlocker, we want to make sure that zero trust is something that's easy to implement and to manage as well. So one of the things that you get with Threatlocker is as soon as you install the Threatlocker agents, we don't want to block everything right away. That would be too bad. That would be too disruptive. We want to learn what's in your environment first. So there is a learning period. By default, it's 21 days, but that can be shortened or extended on a needed basis. And what is it going to do? It's going to learn what you already trust in your environment. What are the applications that you're already allowing your users to run? And it's going to make it's going to make a list of those applications and also make policies to continue to allow these apps to run in your environment. So as you can see here, I have a lot of applications that I'm using in my machine, but I didn't have to come here myself and create these policies one by one. The Threatlocker learning mode did this for me automatically. So this helps speed up the implementation of zero trust and reduce the amount of hours you have to put in to implement this. And when it comes to managing this, we also know there are other things that we can do to make this easy to manage. For example, it's one thing for us to learn what's in your environment today, but we understand updates happen weekly, monthly, and updates are new files. And since we're zero trust and we block by default, if we don't recognize as files, they would get blocked. So that's where built-ins comes in. Built-ins are, and you see this as a tag here, we have a team here at Threatlocker that checks with these programs constantly for new updates, and we capture the hashes of those files and we add them to their application definitions in Threatlocker so that the updates don't get blocked. And we do this for over 7,000 applications. So all those main business apps that you can think of, chances are we already have a built-in for. So this helps. Also, you don't have to be worried that updates are going to get blocked. So when Windows releases an update on a patch Tuesday, our team is already checking with Microsoft, grabbing those hashes, adding them to the Windows core files application so that your updates go smoothly. And then we also need to think about the applications in your environment that we don't have a built-in for, maybe some custom applications. And our learning algorithm can not only learn the hashes of those files, but it can also do what we call custom rules, which is add some flexibility where, like a past version is going to change, the version number is going to change for the file, but if the certificate is the same, we're still going to allow it to run. You can create your own custom rules as well. And with Threatlocker, you also have a solutions engineer that can help you with best practices, with getting yourself onboarded. So it's a very simple thing to implement once you know how to create these custom rules. So zero trust would be something very difficult to do or very difficult to implement. It would require a lot of IT power, a lot of man hours, but with a platform that you can centrally manage all of this, and when it has this very good learning period, all that built-in support happening in the background, it is very feasible and very, very doable. So with security, we always need to think about how to manage it, and that's what this learning period, these built-ins are aimed to do. Is it means to help. It means to help you get going faster with zero trust and to manage it smoothly as well. Go back here. And then the other thing here, on almost finishing here, guys, is we also need to think about a little bit the cloud as well, right? Because we understand a lot of times nowadays we have hybrid environments. We have environments that you still have servers in-house, but you also have a lot of things in the cloud. And zero trust doesn't need to be confined just on the endpoint directly. There are some things that you can do in the cloud as well to help you with adhering to zero trust, like just by ensuring you're working with good companies. There are a lot of cloud solutions out there, and we need to do our due diligence to ensure that those companies are trustworthy, that they can do what you expect them to do. Dual factor authentication, huge thing. A lot of times people think that just because it's in the cloud that they're not responsible to security, and that's just not true, right? Security needs to, we are still responsible for security in the cloud, and there are things that you can do to um, adhere to zero trust and adhere to the principle of least privilege in the cloud as well. IP restrictions wherever possible, sending logs to your SOC or your MDR solution as well. Those are things that can help you not just trust on anything by default just because it's the cloud, but things that you yourself can do uh, for due diligence to make sure that your entire environment is adhering to zero trust, which is really the most effective way at fighting malware, ransomware in 2025. So thank you for your attention here. Hopefully I was able to give you some things to think about and consider when it comes to zero trust, how it is important in your environment. And I will now pass it back to Choice.
Sure. No, thank you so much for that information, and I really like how you really present this as just a part of the holistic sort of approach to security. That even though there's one piece that can't do everything, just making sure that we take a really good strategy uh, holistically. Not to use that word too many times. That's another marketing word for my marketing director there. But yeah, and we'd love to have the conversations with you. I see a lot of familiar names in the attendees list, so love to talk to you about this over lunch or jump on a call or something like that. Oh, and we had a couple questions. I closed the question window just because I let you down. Let me check that out. So we had somebody asking about 24/7 management. Um, it can be, it's available. I know for us here at Choice, the way we sort of model our managed IT services is we are manned 24/7. So those tasks that we're able to sort of take care of for you or anything like that. Yeah, it could be there. The last thing we want though is, and one of the things we have looked at is, I've had users ask me about BYOD and Threat Locker and Zero Trust, and what I'm trying to find academically is that BYOD and zero trust, it's really hard to get those to exist in the same space. Just because you can't exercise the same control over an endpoint, it gets really hard. Not impossible, but there's other things that come into play there. Again, happy to have a conversation with you on that. Uh, a lot of times, if you're trying to avoid interruptions operations during the day or anything like that, you mentioned after hours work, that is something that again can be done at any time as long as the systems are up and the agents are checking in. We can push policy down to take care of that. Matthias, did I hit anything? Did I miss anything weird there? Or
Yeah, no, you're right on. And when it comes to once you've established that zero trust baseline, you've permitted what's needed. We see that a lot of times people are not installing new software all the time, right? So
right,
we don't expect you to receive a request for things all the time. And if that is a concern, one of the things that Threatlocker also offers is cyber hero approval, so you can also leverage our team as well to approve things. So there's a default guidebook that we go by that you can also personalize. So
yep.
we're not going to permit gaming software at 2 a.m. in the morning, or an
What?
IP scanning tool. I know, it's a
That's when Steam
surprise to
drops
a
the good
lot.
stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And so you can leverage that as well. But what I do see in my personal experience is that once we get to that learning mode, for the majority of industries out there, they're not gonna require you to be there on the lookout 24/7 because their applications that they are already running should be continue to run smoothly. So
And
that's a great
and for
question.
for added flexibility, I know looking at the folks who are on this call, we can't get away from these, but ThreatLocker does have a
Yes.
fairly decent app that allows you to do sort of those quick actions of if it's known, it's in users just doing an elevation request. That's really all my team is doing mobily is hey, it's an elevation request. We know what the application is, we know who the user is, we know what the machine is. We're not approving new applications or anything over mobile, and that's a procedural thing for us. You could, but like we mentioned earlier in the presentation, we want to make sure we get that sandboxed and actually test it out if it's something we've never seen before. And then the one other question we had is, can this replace a patch management solution? And that goes back to sort of what I said going into this segment is it's not the everything. However, it can supplement a patch management program and strategy. Um, we know that businesses are very hesitant to be the first guy to install, the patch on that second Tuesday of every month. So we understand there's some lag time. As soon as patches are released, we know that we're on the clock because threat actors have access to the same patching documentation that we do. And so it's a matter of how fast can we get it tested? How fast can we get it deployed and implemented? What ThreatLocker is going to do in that meantime is because it recognizes behaviors and because we've already set that environment permission wise, what's allowed to run, what's allowed to do certain things, that may help mitigate some of those risks that come with that gap in the patch window between your patch release and your well, actually going back to your day zero to your patch release to your patch deployment. So as we look along
Yeah.
that cycle, yeah, we definitely want to make sure that we have another patch management solution. And it might be just policy, right? But hey, we update like this, or you may need to look at a larger, more enterprise tool to push patching out. So that was only the two questions from the crowd. I love it, love it. I'll toss it back over to Dana though, and let him do the last part.
Almost double muted. Yeah, no, thanks, guys. So Mateus, Chris, appreciate it. Yeah, so with like ThreatLocker, obviously it's something, depending on the size of your organization, one of the things for us, through our managed IT services offerings for existing customers and or future ones, use cases, the nice thing, where you need it, as you need it, that's something we can layer in. So the ability to just kind of add that software subscription. Obviously, we've invested in internal expertise to be able to support that and support you. Obviously, depending on the size of your organization, might be something you can subscribe to alternatively as well. So we can help you either way there. And yeah, again, I appreciate the time, appreciate the feedback. I do again the survey. That's important to us. So, in terms of value, insights, anything you learned, if we missed the mark on how we communicated this to you and anything like that, just we highly value that. And then obviously, if there's particular use cases you're thinking about, let's set up a conversation. So just let us know. We can set up a conversation, understand maybe it's a particular application, maybe it's a range of users, or who knows what the scenario might be. But let's have a conversation. We can kind of talk through it and see how it might be, if it's a good fit to help you out, and the kind of next steps there. So with that, we'll send you guys off. We appreciate your time. Enjoy your day again. Mateus, Chris, thank you. Appreciate it. And have an awesome day, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks all.